How's it going, everyone, and welcome to the Ultimate Game Realms radio show. And this is your host and creator, Jason Dixon, logging on. Today I want to talk about the memories of one of my all-time favorite video game consoles, the Sega Genesis, also known as the Sega Mega Drive. 3 years ago, it was the 30th birthday of that awesome 16-bit blast processing console that welcomes you all into the next realm of gaming. Last year, 2021, also marks the 30th birthday on Sega's most iconic hero ever, Sonic the Hedgehog. Welcome to the next level. That was Sega's main slogan, and Sega's previous slogan was an answer to Nintendo as Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The truth is that both Sega and Nintendo can each do what the other can't do. I love both 16-bit consoles regardless, as well as the 8-bit consoles. And when it comes to competition in video game history, the 16-bit wars will always be the best era in the realm of gaming. It'll always be part of my memories forever. Many consumers choose the Super Nintendo over the Sega Genesis, and many consumers choose the Sega Genesis over the Super Nintendo. My Sega Genesis days started on Christmas Eve in 1993, and it was a step up from my NES and Game Boy days. Now, each one of these Sega Genesis games has its own stories. Each one of the Genesis games that I witnessed back in the day, I have my own stories with each one of them, as well as Genesis games that came up later on during the last 30 years, including repo carts and fan-made carts and homebrews and hacks. The whole Genesis library is awesome. Well, the majority of it is. There are a bunch of shitty games in there too. The good games or the bad games, I'll try to get to them eventually when the time comes. But right now I'm talking about my memories with the Sega Genesis, as well as giving my opinions on console version and plus the add-ons. And speaking of the add-ons, that's another thing I like about the Sega Genesis consoles 1 and 2. They have expansion port add-ons where you can actually attach the Sega CD game console add-on to the Genesis, which meaning the Sega CD requires the Sega Genesis in order to play the Sega CD games. Of course, the Sega CD add-ons were more expensive than the Genesis themselves, which is understandable because CD-ROM was practically a new thing all around, especially when it comes to gaming. Even though the direction of the Sega CD wasn't on par with the 16-bit consoles, probably because the 16-bit consoles were cheaper themselves and they actually have a huge library of games, and Sega CD was focusing on pushing full-motion videos into gaming, which was an interesting concept, just didn't catch the eyes of consumers though. I mean, Sega CD also has a decent library of games, including the full-motion video games themselves. It's just that it didn't really caught the attention as the regular 16-bit Genesis did or the Super Nintendo did. Oh, and by the way, my Sega CD stories started as late as 1995, when I actually got the Model 1 Sega CD used from a pawn store, which I was actually pretty impressed with what it can do. Even though the Model 1 Sega CD and the Model 2 Genesis doesn't look presentable, it still worked out for me at the time. I later eventually got the Model 2 Sega CD and the Model 1 Genesis, and I fixed both of them sooner or later. On Sega Genesis and Sega CD also had another device that looked like a portable CD player that was the Sega CD-X, which actually which you can play Sega CD games and Genesis games, and it looked like a portable CD player. I believe you can use that as a portable CD player as well. Kind of thought that was cool. I never did got a chance to get it. I wanted to get one back in the day, but things change nowadays though. And Sega Genesis also had another add-on called the Sega Genesis 32X, or the Sega 32X, whatever you want to call it, which is a big mushroom look-alike device that plugs into the cartridge input on your Genesis. It has a cartridge input of its own too to play 32X games, as well as being backwards compatible with the 16-bit Genesis games. The 32X was targeting to be the enhancer for the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD if you had the Sega CD attachment attached onto the Sega Genesis. Plus, it's backwards compatibility with the regular Genesis games and the regular CD games as well. And like the Sega CD, the 32X cost more than the Genesis itself at launch. And Sega 32X had a lesser lifespan than the Sega CD did. And I didn't really have much of a story of the 32X as I did it with the Genesis and the Sega CD. I didn't get my 32X until years later. However, the 32X was indeed a failure. It did have some good games, but it was a failure. Late 1995, the next generation of gaming was already kicking in, and the 16-bit consoles were still on top of its ball game. And the two Sega add-ons were not being looked into any further because gamers and consumers were already looking into the next generation of gaming, as well as looking into the remaining years of the 16-bit consoles. So the two Sega Genesis add-ons, the Sega CD and the 32X, were discontinued in 1996. While the two 16-bit consoles, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, lived on. And I do also have my own project for the Sega CD and the 32X. The stories of how they started and how they ended. I'm not sure when I'm going to release them yet. I'm still working on them. But right now I just want to get my Genesis memories out of the way first. Also in 1995, Sega released a Sega Genesis portable called the Sega Nomad, which is actually portable like the Game Gear and the Game Boy, except you can actually hook the Nomad up to a TV like you're playing the Sega Genesis, except you're playing a portable for TV. There's also a controller input for a controller too on there. But the only downside is it didn't have a reset button, but oh well. I wanted to get one of those back then too, but nowadays, And their final Genesis console model release was Model 3 that was released in 96 or 97, I believe. I never got my hands on that one either. I have no intention on doing it either. It looked cool, but it just didn't really appeal to me like the first two consoles did because the third model didn't have the Sega CD expansion model on it. And that's pretty much was the downfall of that one. But it did look cool though. Nowadays there's plenty other ways to play Sega Genesis games. Like the official Sega Genesis games off of compilations for third-party consoles. And there's also clone consoles or emulation consoles. And there's even a Sega Genesis Mini that was released about a few years ago that has an awesome library of games as well. If not perfect library, but of course you can actually add games for there too. As time goes by, the Sega Genesis will always be my favorite console, and I will always be revisiting the games in general. It's just that I won't be able to revisit them on old hardware anymore, since they pretty much wear out eventually, and I don't get around to collecting them anymore since you can play majority of the library of cartridge games on clone consoles, or emulation consoles, or even off the emulator, or official Sega games off of compilations for modern consoles. As you can see the background, that I actually posted a lot of Genesis game covers. Those are all the ones I remember the most. Doesn't mean all of them are my favorites, but some of them are pretty much my favorites. It's just that some of them I couldn't get on the wallpaper because just somehow they wouldn't let me put them there, or I just didn't have time to configure them. And they're definitely not my favorite games in order. I'm not sure what my favorite games in general that are in order. But I'm going to get through a majority of them as I can. The ones I love and the ones I dislike. Well, anyway, if there's any Sega Genesis game that any of you want me to look into, no matter if I had any stories with it or not, please leave the name of the game below and I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, I'll try to get that Sega CD project done as soon as I can. That one's going to be an actual project and not an unscripted podcast like this one is. Anyway, thank you all very much for listening. And this is Dixon of the Ultimate Gamer. I'm logging off. And welcome to the next level.